All right, folks, we have some not so good news here for physical video games. Really, it's a number of news items that I wanted to go over. We didn't quite have enough time to do this on LTPS, so I figured why not talk about it separately, because there is a lot here to unpack. And we've been following this for a while, right? I mean, I think, well, certainly me, and I'm sure a lot of you are concerned with where we are right now for physical video games and if we will be able to continue buying and playing and enjoying this stuff into, let's say, the next console cycle, which is really not that far behind, or it's coming up fairly soon. Feels like it's moving way too fast if we're expecting PS6 during holiday 2027. But some of the news items to go over. Now, first and foremost, we did have a somewhat big story break out about 1 or 2 days ago. That was Sony making a formal announcement that they're going to be ending production of rewritable media. So that being like rewritable Blu-ray discs, for example, so you can store your own things on those discs. It's blank storage, obviously. And that's something that is a very niche, really small market relative to even how small printed media is nowadays, but that's always the big caveat with these conversations when we hear doom and gloom in the physical media space, is that it really depends on exactly what we're talking about here. So when we have stories about Best Buy not supplying physical media anymore, but it's actually only for movies, not necessarily games, there's always like certain lines we have to draw as far as what is going on with these news items. So that was one story that did break out. It is a big deal, but in the grand scheme of things, it's a very small portion of what we want to analyze here, and that's not going to have a dramatic effect on, or a big dramatic effect, I should say, on printed media, and in particular, games. So that was one item. The thing we've followed for a long time since this console cycle is that Sony did debut PlayStation 5 as a digital machine and a disc console. Then we had the PS5 Slim, which is really one machine, but there's a separate drive attachment you can either buy as a SKU where it's already plugged in and it's ready to go, or you can buy a digital edition and add a disc drive later, which does have more utility technically, but it's the sales ratio we've been following for a while there, because initially at launch, the numbers we always got was about an 80-20 split. Sony was primarily selling disc consoles, and that means the majority of the PlayStation 5 install base does have the option of being able to buy and play discs. And that's really important to have a sort of minimum install base that, in theory, even if somebody, in terms of their own personal habits, is buying a lot of games on PSN, they still always have that option to buy a disc, which I would always advocate for, is having those options despite even, enjoying digital media. But over time, we've now seen that metric grow more and more to where Sony is now starting to sell a lot more digital consoles. We recently had some data come out from Matt Piscatella of Circana, which this company tracks video game sales data here in the United States, and he did give us a breakdown of some recent sales. So he says in this post here on Blue Sky, and I quote here, 49% of PlayStation 5 and 43% of Xbox Series hardware units sold in December did not include a physical disc drive. For the 2024 year, all digital editions comprised 45% of all PlayStation 5 units sold during the year and 44% of Xbox Series. Now, the Series consoles were always about 50-50 for a long time. That was like even at launch, which to me was very surprising. But it was always 80-20 for PlayStation. That was pretty global as I understand it. It's always important to remember we only get data from the US or the UK or Europe oftentimes, but broadly speaking, it was usually 80-20, and it was starting to creep up as a higher ratio favoring digital machines. Now, in theory, it's good that these digital machines have the option of accepting a disc drive, and it's also important to remember the Pro is only sold as a digital edition, but that's also low volume, so it's not going to really move the needle that much per se, but it can still accept a disc drive, but I digress. The point is, nearly half of all PlayStation 5 sold nowadays are digital machines. So, at least in theory, that is now a much higher minimum of machines that out of the box are not going to be able to play disc. We also had a follow-up post from Matt Piscatella talking about the rate of decline in U.S. video game software sales and spending in 2024, which has been rapidly decreasing. So he did show a very interesting chart that gives a very visual way to illustrate this, because what we can always say in a vacuum is that physical video games, even to this day, is a very big industry. It's, more than, it's nearly $2 billion. However, if you only say that and not show the chart here, that's where you can see the decline is deeply concerning. So, like, the peak was 2008, which the context there for why it was so high, especially during the financial crisis, is we had a high average spend at retail where, like, obviously the online storefronts for, PSN, eShop, Xbox Live Arcade wasn't nearly as big. It was dwarfed by buy very popular things, which at the time was your Rock Band, Guitar Hero, things like that, and those, big box accessories at your GameStop and Walmart and things like that. It was just a very high average spend, so that explains the peak, which was a lot of money being spent back then. But looking at 2020 to 2024, it's pretty alarming. It's a pretty steep decline. Matt even gives a metric here of spending on physical video game software in the U.S. has been cut more than half since 2021 and is now more than 85% below its 2008 peak. He also says we'll see if Switch 2 can help slow or reverse that trend in 2025, which is going to be new hardware that will still accept game cards on for Nintendo, which their model has always looked a little bit different. It's about half for them as far as physical versus digital. Sony, we have seen, and this is where it gets more particular, right, is the software discussion, the actual software breakdown, which I'll always remind people when Sony does outline their sales ratios on their fiscal reports of what they're selling on PSN versus at retail. PSN, that includes all full games. Full games are considered a game that you spend one price and you get an executable that you can download. So that's going to include, bite-sized $2 games, $3 games alongside the things that are at retail. It's, we're talking about thousands of content items, whereas from the Insomniac breach, we had some insight of only a few years ago, which a few years ago does still skew the numbers a bit because we know how fast these things can change. But even just a few years ago, we were seeing that, for example, PlayStation Studio titles had a pretty decent ratio at retail where it was like 30%, 40%. Sometimes it was like right down the middle as far as people were still buying a lot of discs for their PlayStation 5 consoles. But we still have enough data here suggesting that things are going downhill. The concern now becomes PS6 and next gen, where that is coming up very soon. It feels very soon, even though we're on the same timetable as prior console cycles, but it's just, okay, it's going to play discs. I still feel it will play and offer physical media, but now I'm curious as to how narrow that might be. Like, now there's some doubt creeping in my mind of like, well, maybe this will be a cycle very similar to what we just saw with PS5 Pro, where sure, there's an option to buy the drive, but at retail, your only option right then and there is a digital edition console. And that is a big issue because now we're removing what I talked about prior in 2020 with PS5, which is there's a minimum install base where even if users are primarily buying digital, they have the option to buy a disc if they so choose. So if there's no minimum install base in place for the next cycle, I'm like seriously doubting, like, will we get PS6 printed physical media? Will that be something Sony accommodates? Will they do that for their own first-party software? I still find, like, even if it looks severely hampered as far as a separate drive or maybe something that is, like, completely separate and it looks like that 360 HD DVD drive where it's, like, a very afterthought solution where it's like you plug it in via a wire and it hangs off the console or something, and that's your sort of, like, compromise to still play discs on PS6, and maybe it's only for accepting PS4 and 5 ones, because, again, what if they're not going to print PS6 stuff on discs for local playback and storing all that content locally on that disc? I mean, that's where I'm now starting to wonder, how ugly is it going to look like on the next cycle of consoles? Well, console, because Switch, we know, yes, is going to have game cards still. Microsoft, they're done. They're going to exit on their next box. Their customers are primarily digital, which, I mean, Microsoft has condition those customers into playing and engaging with games that way. Sony hasn't been as aggressive in that regard, but they're also not fighting it, obviously. They're actively playing a role in shifting that consumer habit in their own way where it feels a lot more gradual to a degree. But there's that issue. There's the overarching issue of we still need production facilities in the first place for printing physical media and the drives themselves that can then be placed into these consoles. And it starts and ends with the platform holders, because there's only one manufacturer, one company that makes the PlayStation. That's Sony. If they choose to stop doing that, there's no third-party PlayStation 5 or 6 that they will choose to put a disc drive in, right? It's not like other markets, which even though those other markets, a lot of third-party players are exiting and they're done, as we've seen recently with like Samsung and LG. And so it's just, it's not looking good, folks. It's not looking good. It's going to be a lot more narrow. It's, going to get more expensive in some ways, and we'll keep following this very, very closely. But with PS6, I still find it will play discs, but what that's going to look like now might be a little bit more ugly than I was hoping it would be. But anyway, thank you so much for joining me in this conversation and news update, and I will see you all in my next video. You take it easy.